behalf of St. Bede's College, our principal, Dr. Sister Molly, the IQAC, and of course the English department, I, Anuja Sharma, I welcome you all to this webinar on literature in the times of the pandemic. The oft-repeated, unprecedented times, uncertain times, new normal, killer Kalyug, all this has added a terrifying dimension to human life. And byproduct of this trauma is fear, which I believe is a crippler. We, the humans, have cocooned ourselves from everything, including things that are helpful to us. Is it okay? Okay, my voice is echoing, they're telling me, so I'll just go a little back and that should be okay. So I believe that these days, especially these days of COVID-19, we are living in a state of, as they call it, unconscious incompetence. However, after having said that, I will say, apart from deep faith, it is literature which has proved to be a great healer. If there is one thing that literature can do for us, it is to remind us that we are not unique and we are not alone. Somebody said, I think it's Malcolm X, I'm forgetting the name, he said, when I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness. Literature has that power. Literature is powerful because it speaks to the human conditions. It reflects our circumstances and gives meaning to them. The details might be new, but the experiences of fear, isolation, boredom, anxiety, and longing for safety are not new. They are universal longings. And you realize that you are not alone, that you belong. Having said this, to elucidate and initiate the power of literature, I call upon our two excellent speakers of the day, Dr. Parveen Malik and Dr. Anu Jaydev. The first speaker we have is Dr. Parveen Kumar. And Parveen sir, I don't know how to introduce you. I'm so impressed by you, by your demeanor. He's a thorough gentleman and a very dedicated teacher who absolutely loves his subject, that is English. He superannuated after a long and cherished career of 30 years as principal from Government College, Nahan. And sir, you still continue to inspire the teachers of English through that platform, the English Teachers Forum, which you are holding and making it flourish and strengthening it day by day with your sharp perceptions and your brilliant analogies. Sir, we welcome you to this forum, and it is an honor to have you with us here, and we look forward to listening to you and your thoughts on the healing powers of literature. So over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends and students. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, good afternoon, friends and students. I'm happy to be with you this evening, and I'm grateful to the Department of English, St. Bede's College, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. My topic is crisis, creativity, and hope. And the middle term in my topic, creativity, has a very wide connotations, but I'm using it in a very narrow, restrictive sense. It's primarily about artistic creativity, but again, not such artistic forms as music, painting, sculpture, dance, etc., but exclusively with reference to literature. So here I go, crisis, creativity, and hope. In the darkest of times, be they war-induced, precipitated by political crisis, disease, or natural calamities. The force that lightens up human life is invariably literature. Human survival would be a lost project if the life-sustaining mental constructs like literature were to crumble in the wake of a big crisis like a pandemic, or stupefying moral vacuum in the event of a war, or dismantling of a political structure. Be it an internal strife, an external threat, a colossal human tragedy, or the ravages of a sinister pandemic, we need literature to mitigate their impact, interpret, and make sense of hopelessness, fear, moral rot, inexplicable human behavior, and record tales of human triumphs when all seems lost. Darkness is a more powerful and pervasive force than all the positive ones that make our life beautiful, joyful, and appealing. It hits us unpredictably in the weakest and most inopportune moments. It darkens our mental framework and drowns us in unmitigated confusion and hopelessness. The most recent pandemic has done exactly that. It has shaken us to the core of our being, leaving us unsure of our approach to life, human relationships, and disease. COVID-19 has been a crisis of a rare order, which unfortunately caught us unawares and largely unprepared. Though there had been some references to the possibilities of a pandemic in speeches, lectures, conversations of prominent thinkers and leaders, but nobody could imagine the extent of its impact on our lives. It has not only been a health crisis, but also a challenge to the ways we earn our livelihood, go about our daily lives, and interact socially. But it has been more damaging in the sense that it has disrupted our sleep patterns, invaded our psychological spaces, ruffled our bonds with family and fellow humans, and disoriented our outlook on life. But humans have been genetically programmed to find ways to deal with crises and pick threads of hope amidst an all-encompassing gloom. And literature is the most fertile soil in which seeds of hope sprout best. Disease, especially of a kind that kills on a mass scale, inspires storytelling. A collective hysteria grips societies and nations. When an obstruction sets out to kill, meaning is ascribed to death to give it value. It's an attempt to make sense of what is ultimately senseless. A number of novels, poems, etc. have been written on the past pandemics. A similar spurt in literary creativity has been seen since early 2020, which continues to this day. Apocalyptic films have also been made centered around viruses and other deadly organisms. The world is trying to come to terms with the traumatic experiences of the pandemic, and we are turning to fiction, poetry, music, and other creative art forms to find solace and make sense of this utterly hopeless situation. The power of the word can be understood from the fact that people in critical situations often turn to literature. At times, terminally ill persons decide to offer this perspective on life because they wish to articulate their angst, their coping strategies, and what life and death possibly mean to them. Here I'm reminded of a famous Indian origin US neurosurgeon, Paul Kalanithi. He had Indian parents who had migrated very early on to the US, and he was born and brought up in the US, and he studied there. So I'm reminded of a US neurosurgeon, Paul Kalanithi, who was diagnosed with lung cancer and finally succumbed to the disease at the young age of 37. Endowed with remarkable writing abilities, he was inclined to be a professor of English, but his calling lay elsewhere, and he chose medicine. This is how he explains his career choice. Quote, "I had started in this career in part to pursue death. Just look at the choice of words. I had started in this career in part to pursue death, to grasp it, uncloak it, and see it eye to eye, unblinking. Neurosurgery attracted me as much for its intertwining of brain and consciousness as for its intertwining of life and death. I thought that a life spent in the space between the two would grant me not merely a stage for compassionate action, but an elevation of my own being, unquote. It was a tragic irony that he became a patient in the same Stanford hospital where he was an intern. His research had received wide acclaim, and his supervisors visualized him blooming into a distinguished neurosurgeon in times to come. Initially, he had hopes of recovering from illness, but gradually he got convinced that he was dying. And he was heartbroken, but he didn't give up on life. Instead, he decided to make his life and death more memorable and meaningful. He chose to write about his life and experiences as a child, as a medical intern, and the trauma of an approaching death. His book, When Breath Becomes Air. Look at the title, When Breath Becomes Air. As long as one is living, we are breathing. And the moment one dies, the same breath reduces to air. It becomes simple air, meaningless air. So when breath becomes air, that's the title of his book. And in this beautiful book, that's a testimony to his courage, indomitable spirit, flair for writing, and most importantly, his love for life and brush with death. Paul's poor prognosis, Paul is the name of the doctor, Paul's poor prognosis shattered his hopes and dreams of a bright career and a beautiful life, and he found solace in his creative passion. In the last few months, when cancer spread like wildfire, his physical and mental anguish poured out into words. Although writing or anything else for that matter couldn't alter the situation or bring intimations of life, yet his zest for life and love for literature provided him an outlet through which he could recount his experiences, his feelings and emotions, his love for his profession and his family, and the lessons he had for the world. In the epilogue to the book, his wife Lucy says, Paul's decision not to avert his eyes from death epitomizes the fortitude we don't celebrate enough in our death-avoidant culture. I'll repeat the lines. Paul's decision not to avert his eyes from death epitomizes a fortitude we don't celebrate enough in our death-avoidant culture, unquote. He spent much of his life wrestling with the question of how to live a meaningful life, and his book is an exploration of this fundamental question. She further wrote, Paul was proud of this book, which was a culmination of his love for literature. He once said that he found poetry more comforting than scripture, and his ability to forge from his life a cogent, powerful tale of living with death. When Paul emailed his best friend in May, so here is a man who is critically ill, but still able to retain lucidity of mind and the will to give words and shape to his thoughts and emotions. I don't think it's possible most poignant and profound statements on the consequences of a horrifying pestilence. The plague apparently refers to a cholera outbreak in Oran, a French Algerian town on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which took place in the mid-1800s. One finds uncanny similarities with the present pandemic that has left us confused and terrified. Published in 1947, it raises the same questions and concerns that lie at the heart of the current pandemic as well. Now Wuhan, in fact the whole world, is the new Oran, haunted by both disease and the same existential questions. What will happen to me if I get infected? Can I count on my family, friends, and acquaintances? What will be the shape of my life and the world around me once the pandemic passes? How will my family cope if I am gone? What will happen to my dreams and plans? What are the limits of friendship, love, and sacrifice? At the start of the novel, the citizens of the town are indifferent to each other's sufferings. They look utterly selfish in being solely focused on personal safety. Within quotes, in this extremity of solitude, none could count on any help from his neighbor. Each had to bear the load of his troubles alone. If by some chance one of us tried to unburden himself or to say something about his feelings, the reply he got, whatever it might be, usually wounded him, unquote. And this not only makes their lives more miserable, but also makes the task of handling the disease effectively all the more difficult. When the plague continues for months, the residents realize that's a collective disaster that cannot be controlled by alienated society, broken apart into individual units. It's only through social cohesion that the scourge can be handled. The novel is a strong statement about solidarity, the need to have bonds of human love. Man's life is a constant struggle against death and suffering, often resulting in defeat. But defeat is irrelevant. It is the rebellion against the life-destroying forces that makes life worth living. Camus' philosophic musings about the plague apply to all such hell disasters. Quote, there have been as many plagues as wars in history, and they made people ask the same questions about sacrifice, love, death, and destiny, unquote. A pandemic invokes strained responses. Many tend to think that it's a cruel hoax or a bad dream that will pass. Camus writes, but it doesn't always pass away. And from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away, unquote. A pandemic not only throws a spanner in our plans and dreams, but also makes us look selfish, indifferent, and even cruel. Camus writes, there is no denying that the plague had gradually killed off in all of us the faculty not of love only, but even of friendship. In wars and in viral diseases, we turn inwards, go into a shell, lose human touch, and refuse to think beyond ourselves. This kind of callous indifference not only dehumanizes us, it sows seeds of distrust, mutual antipathy, and loss of faith in human goodness. Essential goods, medicines, hospital beds, oxygen supply, and other life-saving essentials gradually disappear from the scene due to human greed and incompetence. But when the disease drags feet, people begin to understand that it's a collective calamity. They now realize that unless they join forces against the silent invader, they would lose the battle hands down. Within quotes, no longer were there individual destinies, only a collective destiny made of plague and emotion shared by all. Such life-altering crises bring out contradictory features of human nature. Again, a quote from the plague, what is true of all the evils in the world is true of the plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. All the same, when you see the misery it brings, you would need to be a madman or a coward or stone blind to give in tably to the plague, unquote. The message is unmistakably clear. There is no point in giving in to the pandemic without a fight. When death stares in the face, the best option is to fight it tooth and nail. Moreover, in this existential battle, there is a possibility that a window of survival and hope opens up. It's interesting to note that the individuals who were happy to isolate themselves fearing the disease soon got tired of it when they were forced into quarantine. But at the same time, it also brought people together and gave them an opportunity to interact with their loved ones on a deeper level. Quote, men who had pictured themselves as Don Juans became models of fidelity. Sons who had lived beside their mothers, hardly giving them a glance, fell to picturing with a poignant regret each wrinkle in the absent face that memory cast upon the screen. These are absolutely beautiful lines. In fact, the mother is now dead, and they are visualizing the kind of wrinkles their mother's face had. So when she was alive, they had no time to look at her mother's face, but now they're able to visualize about the wrinkles on her face. In disruptive times, marked by fear, uncertainties, bewilderment, isolation, personal losses, or catastrophes like the present pandemic, poetry is the most spontaneous response to access and articulate complex emotions that are unleashed in the unprecedented situations. Reading and writing poetry are cathartic. I'm not going to speak much on poetry because the next speaker, Professor Anu Jaydev, she's going to talk in much detail about poetry, but still I'm referring to a few of them. Reading and writing poetry are cathartic. They help resolve inner conflicts and restore emotional balance. As individuals, we all experience a whole set of emotions, but these remain so badly mashed up that they fail to offer any value or insight. It may be worthwhile to know that the Oxford Book of English Verse was the most widely read book in the trenches during the First World War. The current pandemic has brought about massive shifts on the personal and collective level, much of which is incomprehensible at the moment. W.B. Yeats's famous lines from The Second Coming, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world," are so hauntingly relevant today. An American poet, Carmen Tafila, she has given a twist to these lines. In fact, the first line, and that captures the essence of the situation remarkably well. What she has done is she has retained the first part of the sentence and made some changes to the second part of it. So she has written it like this: things fall apart, sometimes people do. It means the situation is so terrible that things are falling apart and people are also falling apart. W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939 is a significant poem that marks the beginning of the Second World War and to which readers love to go back from time to time when confronted with crises of a personal or collective nature. However, Auden came to despise this poem, particularly one line. And the line in question is, "We must love one another or die." We must love one another or die. He said to himself, that's a damned lie. We must die anyway. So in the next edition, he altered it to, we must love one another and die. That's the change he made. Very slight change. He replaced or with and. We must love one another and die. He was still not satisfied. He felt the whole poem was infested with incurable dishonesty and so must be scrapped. It's a uniquely positioned example in literary history of a writer attempting to revise his work and of readers refusing to allow the change. Despite Auden's attempt to dismember and destroy the poem, it has survived and even thrived. It won't ever die because it offers us what we most desperately need, and that's hope. I'm quoting a few lines from the poem. That's the beginning. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire. Of a low dishonest decade, waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth. And these are the last line. Obsessing our private lives, the unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. And the last part of the poem is, defenseless under the night, Our world in a stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere. Ironic points of light flash out whenever they just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same, negation and despair, show an affirming flame. This is the last word, affirming flame. It means the poem ends on a note of positivity. A number of books on the themes of fear, loss, isolation, and grief wrought by the pandemic have been published in 2020 and 2021. Viral Verses, Art in Exceptional Times, edited by Nicholas and Stephen Lindstedt, is one such beautifully crafted anthology of poems and illustrations featuring 87 contributors, the majority of whom are students or faculty members at the University of York. The passing of an old musician friend, Ted Crum, during the pandemic prompted Professor Lindstedt to create the anthology. I'm just reading one small poem from this collection, and the title is This Is Our Blitz, and the writer is Joe Solo. This is our blitz. No sound of bombs, no sirens, drones. Our desks will hide away at home. This war is behind closed doors. It's me and mine. It's you and yours, self-isolated in our shelters, playing the hand that fate has dealt us. Who knows where the next bomb hits? This is our blitz. This is our blitz. And like before, we'll face the worst, the poverty that always cursed us, puts us now on the front line, where some will buckle, some will shine, yet most will sail this sea of trouble and rise once more from the rubble, hence held out through hearts and bits. This is our blitz. And who can forget these lines of Sumitrandan Pant? वियोगी होगा पहला कवि, आह से उपजा होगा गान, निकल कर आंखों से चुपचाप बही होगी कविता अनजान. This viyog, this separation, this again is a crisis. This is a crisis on a personal level. So I'm concluding now. Crises tend to demoralize us, erase our zest for life, fill us with gloom and dash our hopes. But as a beautiful byproduct, creativity comes along, interprets the crises, and fills us with hope, protecting against the pervasive gloom that is ever ready to drown us in its whirlpool. Hope, even if unfounded, is the most unassailable protective gear humans can put on in the face of despair and despondency. Camus seems to agree. Within quotes, once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of plague was ended. I'll repeat the lines. Once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of plague was ended. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Wow. I can just say, wow. We were listening to each and every line, so well researched, right from the story about the doctor in the US. And then lines, poetry is more comforting than the scriptures sometimes. And it is so true. It is so true. No wonder great writers express themselves so beautifully. And of course, one thing I liked was rebellion against life-taking forces is what life is about. That is what I learned. You said it and I got it very clearly. And I guess life is a wrestle all the time. And I'm sure the others agree with us. And if you have your questions and you have your comments, we'll take it after Dr. Anu Jayadev's discourse. And then together, the speakers can take up our answers, our questions, and our queries. Over to you, Anu. Yes, you'll have to switch on your video. Thank you so much, sir. Now you are going to listen. Yes, Anu, there I want to see your happy, smiling face.
Right, ma'am.
So for all who are present here, Anu Jayadev Kareer. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Right, ma'am.
Okay, Anu Jaydev Karir is teaching at Maharaja Agrasen College, University of Delhi. She has researched extensively on tribal narratives, cultural historiographies of itinerant communities, especially Romani lives, and also worked on the narratives of the Indian emergency of 1975-77. And well, she's a poet and a translator too. And I want to make a personal note here. She is not only my student, of course, she makes me very proud today, but she is the daughter of an illustrious teacher, a very humble, fine human being who I was fortunate to have as my teacher, Professor Jaydev. And I still hold on to a paper I wrote on the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne, and Sir just gave a small tick and wrote, "Just too good." I still have it because it was a very rare thing that Sir would give. And Anu, you have done him proud and you have done us proud. And so happy to have you here. And all I can say is looking forward to listening to you. So welcome on board, Anu Jaydev Karir.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that very sweet and personal introduction. I am so happy to be here. It's a different feeling to come back to one's alma mater,
yes,
and to be in the presence of someone like you. We were just so happy to be in the penumbra of your presence in every single class. I still remember every time you'd ask a question, we just frantically raise our hands, even if we didn't know the answer. It was just important enough to be noticed by you. And you were always so kind, always so compassionate. And it's been such an honor to have been your student.
Oh, thank you.
So, right. So, ma'am, thank you so much for having me here. I would like to thank all the teachers who are present here, all my colleagues, all my fellow students, and all of my students who happen to be here today, as well as all of my family members, several of them who are here. So it's just such a privilege to know that you are so loved and so valued, that everyone sort of just, closes ranks around you. So that's just such a beautiful feeling. I would like to thank Dr. Praveen Kumar for his brilliant presentation. That kind of sets the broader perspective for what I have to say. And of course, it's as always a great pleasure to listen to him, and not at all a pleasure to follow him in terms of one's own presentation, because if one has Dr. Praveen Kumar speaking before oneself, one is filled with a sense of trepidation. That's only natural. But, well, there is work that I have to do, and I should. So I'd like to start on with my presentation. And I have a PPT presentation here. It kind of works, and this is also for students who will be making presentations from now on in their future. A PPT is good because it offers you a kind of quick cheat sheet. It helps you if you think you're not looking too good, because the attention is on the PPT, and it helps you to just sort of get things in order. So here I'd like to start with my PPT. It just might take a while to sort of get this in order, but please, right. Yeah, this software sometimes takes a while to get loaded, so please have patience, and we will begin as soon as we can. Is the presentation visible? I'm sorry, I just, please give me just one moment here. Yeah, apologies. I usually work with a different program. So, all right. So, is the presentation visible now? Anuja ma'am, is the presentation visible?
Yes, we can see it, Anu.
All right, fair enough. Thank you. Okay, so taking forward from the presentation by Dr. Praveen Kumar, I would like to focus on this specific aspect of what I considered is required writing and the imperatives of all kinds that exist within the pandemic situation as we have today, and the situation of poetry that we have within that larger context of the pandemic. So let's just look at some framing questions before we move ahead with this. So the questions I think that in some ways need to be asked are the following. How does the pandemic get written? What all gets written into COVID's wide-ranging narrative? And what all does COVID get written into? So, of course, there are ways that we write into the narrative of COVID. And there is a lot of stuff that gets written into the larger narrative as we have it. And then, in what ways does COVID get constituted in collective human memory? Second question, what drives this kind of writing? What is this collective, almost visceral impulse to record it in certain ways? How do we read this kind of writing, which in a major way comes about because of its own imperatives? What do we make of these imperatives that snatch away the luxury of human contemplation of itself in terms of its individual uniqueness and forces humanity to think of itself in terms of collective populations gaping at apocalypse and increasingly at the mercy of invasive biopolitical state apparatuses? In these circumstances, how do we perceive the shift in the nature of an overwhelming existential crisis, which literally becomes about existence than any philosophical contemplation of it? Final question is that of required writing, a phrase that I borrow from Larkin, which incidentally he used for general prose writing and general journalistic pieces. But here I would like to consider required writing as a feature of poetic writing. And I would think that required writing is remarkably well suited to a certain kind of writing happening right now. So these are some of the questions, and to sort of clinch the positions I take here, I'll consider some poems as illustrations of the principle of required writing. And of course, with the principle of required writing come the attendant perils that follow required writing. Species. In history, do we have instances? Yes. In our current lived experience, no. Nothing that collectively embroils all of us together in a crisis like this particular pandemic does. So expectedly, the discourse around COVID displaces a lot of linguistic patterns and usages, and even semantic and syntactic associations. There is a shift in assumed and attributed meanings of simple everyday terms of reference as language itself struggles to accommodate the very urgent requirements generated by the crisis. A lot of COVID writing, therefore, is in the fashion of journalistic reportage, even when it is about private subjective testimonies. See, the meanings of things have changed, which is something that you inadvertently encounter the moment you decide to just basically Google a couple of terms. So if you Google COVID literature, it throws up all kinds of discursive literature related to medical and behavioral research and pandemic protocols, not literature about the pandemic per se. COVID stories, similarly, is a phrase which lines up all possible journalistic, medical, individual, as well as collective testimonies recorded through the pandemic. COVID fiction or even COVID narratives inevitably collates fiction versus facts relating to the nature of the pandemic, and again, the narratives about the pandemic in general public discourse. So after all of this, I decided to Google COVID novel. And what did I find? COVID novel interestingly lists most searches relating to the novel coronavirus. So what I'm trying to say here is that the meanings and associations that we usually attribute to certain terms have changed. So let's just look at pandemic and poetry for one instance. As I was saying, the conjunction of COVID pandemic with associations of all possible endeavors, which are creative, inevitably bring to the fore a vast body of referential output, not necessarily always creative. And much of this output is overwhelmingly and definitively literal. In this light, one might feel that the literary imaginary, regardless of how literateurs want to see it, is perhaps not really the crucial category through which the pandemic is contemplated or even made sense of. Or perhaps it is. Let's look at some more fun facts when we launch into some basic researches about COVID and creativity and so on. So there are 56 crore search results which come up for COVID creative writing. Okay, now please understand that when you do this kind of basic research for COVID creative writing, okay, on the basic Google platform, then 56 crores or thereabouts is the number that you hit. And this is about creative writing. It is about anthologies. It's about presentations. It's about all kinds of things. It's also in certain cases about what has to be written and how it has to be written, and what are the ways of creating some sort of output across literary art forms in traditional as well as digital media. So if you look at this figure of 56 crores, it is a figure which is almost as robust as the figure of 59 crores. And what exactly is 59 crores? 59 crores is the figure for search results on COVID-19 protocols by the Google search engine. And COVID-19 protocols as such would be ubiquitous everywhere, all right? So between 56 crores and 59 crores, there is not too much of a gap. And so if COVID creative writing almost commands a similar kind of number that COVID protocols command, then we need to think about COVID creative writing seriously. So out of this massive general miscellany of 56 crores, which is pretty massive, come to think of it, okay, and this will include your tweets, your blogs, your Facebook entries, all kinds of things, okay, all kinds of videos, digital productions, everything. So in the midst of all of this, there is a pretty significant chunk of 16 crore 70 lakh, which is associated with COVID poetry. 16 crore 70 lakhs. So yes, and I'm sure it is no surprise, people are writing poetry about the pandemic, perhaps more than they are writing about anything else, more than they have written about other calamitous, life-threatening events, say like cancer. If you look up cancer poetry, you get around 5 crore 68 lakh results, I'm sorry. That's less than half the results of what you get for COVID poetry. So there. And cancer has been around for a much longer time. It has been tremendously destructive to people, and it is a massive presence in the community as such, but still, look at what COVID has garnered over 1.5 years versus what cancer has over those many years of internet availability. Of course, this is not really a very definitive kind of analysis because there are some generic kind of searches which will yield far more numbers in terms of results. So if you look at chocolate cake recipes, for instance, you will run about 90 crore potential, results. Climate change similarly goes beyond 90 crores, and for that matter, even cat videos go far beyond these numbers. But I do hope you get the point that I'm trying to make here, which is that this unthinkable, imponderable, potentially extinction level event, Covet, this event generates poetry like it generates no other literary response. 8th graders are writing poetry about the pandemic, so are college students. There are online poetry slams on the pandemic. People are blogging, vlogging, gramming, booking, tweeting, and whatever else you have. In fact, people who have never thought of writing poetry are also writing pandemic poetry. So why is this poetry getting written? Poetry because poetry is the most effective creative form for capturing the human predicament in the face of overwhelming conditions. In duress, needing little support and even lesser interaction, it is a relatively quickly realizable endeavor that can be carried out in isolation. That's the basic fact about writing poetry. There is also another way to look at it. I look at poetry as a bioindicative literary form. This is a term that comes from the life sciences. Bioindicative species are species which reveal the conditions of the general environments as such. So I think of poetry as a bioindicative literary form because it reveals the state of the existing conditions of the general environments better than all other forms of creativity. Poetry is at once personal, high on emotional expression, capable of being at once individual and contextual and general and universal because it is so intensely connotative. A poem is always so much more than what it says. It captures the articulation of the otherwise inarticulable. So, in the current pandemic, known and collectively understood, but still experienced individually and subjectively, poetry becomes a way of capturing the heightened sense of human isolation and vulnerability in the face of a potentially extinction level event, or at the very least one event which is capable of disrupting our lives and existence as we know it. Of course, COVID-19 isn't the only crisis that does that. We have a full range of disasters right now, which range from forest fires to hurricanes to earthquakes to floods to landslides and all kinds of viral and bacterial and vector-borne infections to state-level takeovers, you name it. All of this is happening as COVID is happening. But what is special about COVID is how it forms the a priori, the always already existing condition against which everything else gets played out. So when we read poetic narratives, we have to understand one thing. These are survivors' articulations. These are somber, serious, pensive, desperate also. At times, especially during the first COVID wave, they were often hopeful and triumphant. But necessarily see this, these were the survivors' articulations. The dead don't send postcards from heaven. It is the survivors who write. They write of pain, trauma, bereavement, loss, and lots of survivors' guilt. So here is a poem that a friend of mine shared with me. Mona Sinha shared this poem with me by Raj Sinha, who's a poet based in Mumbai. And this is called Imagine 20. So the poem begins with how things would be when we stopped out of our doorways, imagining that this is a poem written sometime, someday in the future. And of course, this was composed in 2020, when there was this sense of triumph, there was this at least expectation that we would defeat the pandemic and that we would emerge out of it completely victorious. Okay, so here is this poem. because I'm not sure of how much time I have, I will not take the liberty of reading through the poem. But and of course, I'll share it with the teachers so that they can share this with the students. So it's all about how there is a kind of wisdom that comes post-pandemic, and when people sort of reclaim the spaces that they occupied, they realize that nature has reclaimed the same spaces too. For instance, there is a line here which says, "Some crows came swooping down and shat on us. They were scared no more. Chastened and crowned, we turned to go." Okay, so essentially the idea that that we did have during the first wave of the pandemic, when we assumed that there would be a kind of reset in terms of how we looked at our world and how we connected with the world, with hopefully sparrows in the turrets and squirrels in the towers, and a humanity just expecting a kind of more integrated kind of existence with the rest of the planet. This was, please remember, the first wave of Covet. I would also like to share quickly Gulzar's poem, which is called Mahamari Lagi Thi. And Gulzar himself, I believe, has translated some bits of this poem, but it's almost a travesty to try to translate Gulzar. So I will not translate him, I will just read this poem in its entirety because it deserves that. महामारी लगी थी, घरों को भाग लिए थे सभी मजदूर कारीगर, मशीनें बंद होने लग गई थीं शहरों की सारी, उन्हीं से हाथ पांव चलते रहते थे, वरना जिंदगी तो गांव में ही बोके आए थे। वो 1 एकड़ और 2 एकड़ जमीन और 5 एकड़ कटाई और बुआई सब वहीं तो थी, ज्वारी धान मक्की बाजरे सब, वो बंटवारे चाचे और ममेरे भाइयों से, फसाद नाले पे पर नालों पे झगड़े, लठैत अपने कभी उनके, वो नानी दादी और दादू के मुकदमे, सगाई शादियां खलियान, सूखा बाढ़, हर बार आसमां बरसे न बरसे, मरेंगे तो वहीं जाकर जहां पर जिंदगी है, यहाँ तो जिस्म लाकर प्लग लगाए थे, निकालें प्लग सभी ने, चलो अब घर चलें और चल दिए सब, मरेंगे तो वहीं जाकर जहां पर जिंदगी है. So I'm assuming since we are having this presentation in the Northwestern Belt, most of us can somehow manage to get the basic gist of what this poem is. But for those of us who can't, let me just offer a bit of a transliteration, which is that Gulzar is basically talking about the migrant crisis, which happened again during the first wave of the crisis, when migrants were struggling hard to get home. And it's about reiterating the fact that their lives were actually left back in their villages. These were just livelihoods. What they had in cities were just their livelihoods. Okay, but all the associations of one's lifetime, all of one's relationships and the people one knew and the life that one valued, in any case, had been left behind in the villages. And if one were to die, one wanted to go back to the place of one's birth. So for several reasons, it's so poignant because it talks about what really matters to us. So when we did have this massive exodus of the migrant populations from the cities back to the villages, it is not something that we can just brush aside as people's insanity, because there is so much more to such an emotion which impels people to get back to where they came from. And at some level, it's fundamentally that you do not want to die in an alien place where nobody knows you. That's perhaps just what it was. So with that very fine poem, we come to Covet Poetry Part 2. This is the poetry that got written after the second wave of COVID, and this was in no ways as intellectual or detached, or what shall we say, as elegant in some ways as you would find the earlier bits of poetry. And even in cases where it manages to be very elegant, it is still tremendously pained. For instance, there is this colleague of mine, Mona Sinha, who wrote a beautiful poet, which was entitled, and I now realize I should have shared this poem right here, but apologies to all. I don't have the poem with me right now, but I will share it later. So Mona Sinha, in an untitled poem, captures the deafening silence around COVID tragedies that were witnessed in the second wave. And in this poem, she talks about how there are things that are not talked about. Tragedies are not talked about. Losses are not talked about. So in this beautiful small poem, she questions the distinction between being alive and being dead in the midst of an overwhelming sense of reaching one's breaking point. So this is a very small poem, a very, very elegant poem. And yes, I would like to share it at some point, though of course right now I don't have it and I don't quite know how to sort of get it here right now. Anyhow, so that's one poem that I'd like to talk about by Mona Sinha. The second poem, which perhaps has been circulating around on social media, is called Guzarti Ambulance, which has been recited by Siddhant Chaturvedi, an actor. And this poem focuses on the imminent intimations of mortality that the persona of the poem confronts in terms of the ambulance's siren as it crosses by his street. He talks about his, relatively safe, well-ensconced life, and how there are no immediate threats to him. But whenever this ambulance siren goes by, as the ambulance crosses his street, he is somehow sort of, jostled into this awareness of how this pandemic is killing so many people known to him, so many people close to him, even though it hasn't really touched him directly. So that's one. Of course, please understand, I'm not referring to all possible poems here. If the number is anywhere close to 16 crores, it will be the end of my lifetime before I can even read through the titles of all of them. So I have my limitations, all of us do. Okay. Artificial intelligence can catalog results. What human beings can actually manage to read in a definitive time frame is quite different. So there we have it. Anyhow, so these are two poems. Then I would like to refer to poems that are angry, vehement, irreverent, potentially disruptive, and all of the above, which invoke leaders, sahibs, and shehenshahs in the higher echelons of authority. And some of these poems are outright disruptive and challenging to authority as we know it. However, my submission here is that to hold such poems to their words is to somewhere miss the point. One cannot accept interminable misery and grief. One cannot expect this kind of interminable misery and grief to have a sense of grace. So there is going to be anger, and there's going to be vehemence, and there is going to be that sense of absolute disillusionment with the powers that be, and that is only natural, because how does one get past that? So to all people who feel really offended by certain kinds of poems, this is all that I have to say. When misery strikes, when grief strikes, people don't necessarily care about how they put things into words. Now, towards the end of my presentation, I would like to refer to a difficult COVID poem, which for reasons of basic sanity or perhaps cowardice, I will not name in this presentation. This is a poem from one unsuspecting woman poet who rushed where angels fear to tread. So there is a lot that has to be said about the treading, the telling, and the after. And all of that makes for a very interesting story for another time. The intent of the poem, we are told, was outright offensive. And as I say that, I want to come back to the question of required writing and required reading along with required writing. And all I have to say is this: we need to be able to read things that we like and things that we don't, regardless of where we stand on the spectrum, which in any case looks increasingly like an infinity loop these days. Go figure. Poetry, or at least the reasonably good kind of poetry, has never been in the establishment as such, has never been in the business of political endorsement any which way. Now, one wouldn't want to offend, considering how easily poetry offends these days. But we live in a world where simple bare facts also give offense, so to be offended by a poem perhaps is not such a bad thing. Or is it? I'm not sure. Anyhow, there are poems which are considered controversial, offensive, and they exist. And we may not agree with them, but it is also important to realize that they're coming from a human place, from a human perception, and not necessarily essentially from a space which wants to disrupt and destruct everything. So the unnamed poem in question, which cannot be bypassed in this discussion, will not be named. I could have shared it, but that would have meant tremendous amount of redaction, which basically would have rendered the poem quite pointless. My suggestion to all students and all colleagues and contemporaries and my friends here is that we all should go find out all kinds of difficult poems and read them for ourselves. And be forever wary of platitudes and prescriptions about what may or may not be read. That effectively will be the death of poetry as we know it. To end my presentation, I'd like to sort of just quote from Adrian Rich. And this is an image from Quote Fancy, because obviously if I'm borrowing the image, I need to refer to where I'm borrowing it from. Adrian Rich, in one of her essays, I think this is from When We Dead Awaken, she says, poems are like dreams. In them you put what you don't know you know. In poetry, you put what you don't know that you know. As writers, as readers, as students of literature and culture, as people, as stakeholders within our democracy, I think that's a pretty good place to begin. To start excavating what we don't quite know that we do know. That will be all. Thank you.
Wonderful, Anu. Wonderful. Before complimenting you, let me compliment myself that I must have been a fine teacher to have produced a student like you. Wow.
Absolutely, ma'am.
But jokes apart, it was beautiful. And, you made poetry synonymous with what you don't know, you know. It is, your expressions beautifully. I think the way you started with those 56,000 crores and came down to those very, very few essential poems that you picked up, amazing. Amazing journey through the mental landscape of COVID times. Thank you so much, Anu.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I hand over to Gitanjali ma'am now. She takes over.
Sure, ma'am.
It was an excellent presentation made by Dr. Anu Jaydev, as well as a brilliant presentation by Professor Praveen Kumar. I compliment both of you for this time you gave us and the vistas that you've opened for us, the kind of reading we need to do to create a balance in our lives. Literature is the only place we can resort to. So it was wonderful. Before we finally wrap up, if there are any questions from our participants, we are open to those questions. Our resource persons, our speakers for the day, would be answering those questions. So kindly come up with them. If you have any, you can unmute yourself and you can ask the questions directly. Are there any questions, clarifications, any queries? You're open to take them. We are open. Yes. You can raise your hand also if you like, or simply type it in the chat box.
I have a comment.
Sure.
First of all, I'm very happy to come back to college. And, even if on an online platform, but it's a pleasure being here. And thank you for organizing this talk. It has been really, really wonderful listening to both the speakers. And one thing that I'd like to add, it's just a observation, and I feel uh, despite being wonderful presentations, these both the presentations have been a little disturbing as well. And I think one important aspect of literature is that it does disturb you. And when we kind of get accustomed, or when we kind of internalize this disturbance within us, it is only then that the sense of hope arises. And I think these 1.5 years, particularly in terms of writing and the kind of writings, the different forms which have come up, I'm sure like 5 years down the line we would be looking at the kind of experiments that have happened, in the kind of writings which we've seen around. And of course, with new platforms like social media and mobile novels and flash novels, flash stories, we're going to be we would be like looking at different forms for sure. And of course, Anum has also opened up a certain kind of a methodology, right, to look at how social media in itself has become a very, very important aspect of our research, and how do we kind of also contemplate it with not just the method but also the content that we are looking at. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Ishmeet. It was lovely hearing your voice after many, many years. And welcome back to the college once again. We'll see more.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Yes. Any more questions or observations? You can just come up with them. All right. The chat box is full of wonderful things about our speakers today. You can read some of the comments that have been given by our audience and our listeners. They are calling it a wonderful presentation, enjoyed it, pertinent questions have been raised. And we are also reading that people are very glad to be a part of it. So we are really fortunate that we had these two speakers with us today. It was a pleasure to listen to them. It was indeed a pleasure listening to Professor Praveen Kumar Malik and Dr. Anu Jaydev. You both were brilliant. Brilliant could also be an understatement for today's
True.
presentation and lecture. It was so gripping that I think we did not look the other way for a moment also. We were trying to read, we were trying to grasp, we were trying to soak in as much as we could. So it was indeed great. To sum up the presentations made by both of them, starting with Professor Praveen Kumar's presentation. So he brought up he took up two interesting texts, and he talked about these two texts, When Breath Becomes Air and The Plague. So we understood that we are also experiencing very dark times. We've also had difficult moments. Each one of us has really faced this fear, this uncertainty. Each one of us has experienced it. But when we read that and we see it from another's perspective, then it kind of brings a balance in our lives. So literature is so very important to bring this balance. We've understood it today, and through these two brilliant speakers, it has become really, really clear. So Sir talks about the solidarity. He talks about the solidarity that binds us all, the hope that is there, and the overwhelming crisis, which always brings us, towards the end, there is hope. So we cannot lose hope, even if the crisis is of this nature that we experience. So I'm reminded of Giv Patel's poem on killing a tree. I think many of you may have recalled or read that. And so here also we see that man cannot be defeated. So this is the beauty of it all. We will be victorious. We are fighters. We are fighting. We will continue to fight. Yes, it's not always that great. It's not always that easy, but the fight goes on. So once again, sir, I take this opportunity on behalf of the entire team to thank you. Thank you is not a word sufficient enough to express what we are really feeling. We will have to really, yes, Anu is raising her hand. Would you like to say something?
Please continue with Anjali. I'd like to compliment Dr. Praveen Kumar on his presentation after you're done, please.
All right. Okay. So this is what he brought into perspective today, and he also selected very beautiful poems for us to make us realize what we could read and what we still haven't read. So it touched our hearts. It was a heart-touching presentation made by you, sir. Thank you again. Dr. Anu Jaydev raised, in her outstanding presentation, raised very pertinent questions to do with poetry. How does the pandemic get written? Then what drives the kind of writing that there is during these times? How should we read? What kind of poetry there is? And the volume of poetry that is written during these times. So we are all going through this turmoil, psychological, mental, the state of mind. But when we actually read it in literature, that is when it awakens us. It makes us aware that it is a kind of a collective consciousness that we are all going through. So it is sad, like Ishmeet, and disturbing, very disturbing. But then it makes us realize that we are not alone in this. We are together. We are fighting. And perhaps no one knows what the outcome will be. The fear and uncertainty remains. So Anu, I really don't have words to express what I'm feeling. But perhaps I'll also write a poem on the two presentations that I've heard today. They were really fabulous. So a great round of applause, a big round of applause for the two of them. Thank you once again. My gratitude would remain incomplete without thanking the team working with us today. I would like to thank Mr. Ashish and Mr. Bhupinder for helping us out, for putting this all together for all of you. And also the audience who have been patiently listening. And of course, it has opened a whole new world of literature to us, which we are going to explore. Whether we like it or we don't, we will be reading it as Anu has suggested. Writing is cathartic. We are going to also get into some of it. So many crores are writing. I think we should also draw the inspiration and become writers at this point of time. So excellent presentation. A few words about hope now, which I had penned down and taken from somewhere. It says, hope is the one thing that can help us get through the darkest times. So let's live with this hope. Let's keep the hope alive and keep learning, keep listening. I hope the two speakers will consent to be with us again many times over. We cannot let you go so easily. We'll be inviting you. Please do consent to be with us. Thank you once again. Thank you so much. Yes,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think Dr. Praveen Kumar has done something to say, so I'd let him speak first because.
No, I have nothing to say. I'm very happy to be part of this webinar. That's all I have to say about it. And your present was excellent, and Gitanjali has given elaborate explanation to what you have done. So it was very majestic. In fact, it was so well researched. So we got to know so many things about it. And Ishmeet Kaur's observations I found to be very relevant and very useful, because the main idea that she suggested was that literature, which is very disturbing, is ultimately very useful also. And Anu has also said something very similar, that we must try to read each and every kind of literature, not restrict ourselves to a certain kind of, even if there are some people who suggest that this is the kind of literature that we should read, or that should be avoided. So thank you very much, and thank you, St. Bede's College, for giving us this opportunity, the Department of English, Dr. Anuja, Dr. Gitanjali. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'd request you for a picture now. Please turn on your camera so that we can take a picture with all of you.
Sure. In the meantime, can I say something?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Praveen Kumar for his absolutely erudite and brilliant presentation. There is always so much to learn from him. I think we should actually consider having some kind of coaching classes with Dr. Praveen Kumar, because he has just so much to offer. It's quite incredible.
Yes.
I would like to thank the college and I'd like to thank you, Gitanjali, personally, for just taking this chance on me. That was just so generous of you.
The pleasure was entirely ours, and we stand to gain. So, Anu.
Thank you. That's very kind and very, very generous of you. I'd like to thank Deepthi ma'am for being here throughout the presentation. It was just so amazing to have you here.
I loved it, Anupama. How can I ever forget you? How could I have missed your presentation? You have always been a bright student, and as Ma'am Anuja said, oh my God, we are so proud to be your teachers. Yeah.
Ma'am, thank you so much. And we were just so proud to be your students, because we still remember the times when you had those allergy attacks and we would sit under those great conifers, and you would just be working so hard to just make sure that you took that class regardless of everything, and how you made sure we had all possible notes and everything in order. And as I said before, Anuja ma'am's compassion beats everything else, because there was not one point when I felt I faltered and there was judgment in her eyes. And that, I think, is the best gift that one can expect from a teacher. Ma'am, I'm so honored to have been your student. It has been absolutely brilliant. I'd like to thank my friend Ishmeet for being here, and Leena, and my friends Gitanjali, Mona, Charu, Aditya, and all possible friends. And if I forget any names, please consider things rendered, because it's just so overwhelming right now to just be here. Thank you so much for everything. Completely honored, completely floored. Thank you. Thanks, ma'am.
Can we just request everyone to turn on their cameras for a picture?